September 7, 1812. On a vast rolling plain 75 miles west of Moscow, two of the largest armies ever assembled are about to collide. This isn't just another battle. This is the Battle of Borodino, a day that will be forever etched in history as one of the bloodiest single-day actions of the Napoleonic Wars. On one side, Napoleon Bonaparte, the master of Europe, leading his Grande Armée of over 130,000 men. On the other, the stoic Russian general Mikhail Kutuzov, commanding a slightly smaller but fiercely determined force, ready to defend their motherland to the last man. For Napoleon, this was meant to be the decisive blow. For months, his massive army had been marching deep into the heart of Russia, chasing an enemy that refused to give him the grand, conclusive battle he so desperately craved. The Russians, under their previous commander Barclay de Tolly, had adopted a scorched earth policy, retreating ever deeper, stretching Napoleon's supply lines to the breaking point and frustrating the emperor's plans. But the constant retreat was demoralizing for the Russian troops and nobility. The pressure on Tsar Alexander the Firm was immense. He needed a stand. He needed a battle. And so he appointed the veteran, one-eyed General Kutuzov, a man who understood both the art of war and the Russian soul. Kutuzov knew he had to fight, not just for strategic reasons, but for the honor of Russia itself. He chose his ground carefully near the village of Borodino, fortifying his position with a series of earthworks, most famously the Raevsky Redoubt at the center and the Bagration flèches on his left flank. His plan wasn't necessarily to win a glorious victory, but to inflict such terrible casualties on the French that they could not continue their campaign. It was a strategy of attrition, a bloody calculation designed to bleed the Grande Armée white. As the sun rose on that fateful September morning, the air was thick with anticipation. Napoleon, suffering from a cold and a foul mood, surveyed the Russian lines. He dismissed his marshal's suggestions for a flanking maneuver, opting instead for a brutal, direct frontal assault. "The wine is drawn," he famously declared. "It must be drunk." He believed the sheer power and elan of his French troops could smash through the Russian defenses. The battle began around 6:30 a.m. with a deafening roar as over 1,000 cannons opened fire, a terrifying artillery duel that would last all day. The French first threw themselves at the village of Borodino itself, but the main thrust was directed at the Bagration flèches. What followed was a maelstrom of violence. French columns advanced into a storm of canister and musket fire, clashing with Russian defenders in a desperate, chaotic struggle. The flèches, a series of 3 arrow-shaped earthworks, became a human slaughterhouse. They were taken and retaken multiple times throughout the morning, the ground piled high with the dead and wounded from both sides. Marshal Davout's corps led the charge, with Marshal Ney, the bravest of the brave, throwing his men into the fray with reckless courage. Prince Pyotr Bagration, the fiery Georgian prince commanding the Russian left, was everywhere, rallying his men, a constant inspiration in the face of the onslaught. But around mid-morning, disaster struck the Russians. A shell fragment shattered Bagration's leg. As he was carried, mortally wounded from the field, the morale of his soldiers faltered. The French finally seized the ruined, corpse-choked flèches. With the Russian left flank crumbling, the focus of the battle shifted to the center, to the massive earthwork known as the Raevsky Redoubt, or the Great Redoubt. This was the key to the entire Russian position. Napoleon ordered Prince Eugène de Beauharnais to capture it. The initial French attacks were repulsed with horrific losses. Russian General Yermolov, seeing the chaos, personally led a counterattack, retaking the position in a furious bayonet charge. The fighting here was some of the most intense of the entire Napoleonic era. It was a vortex of cannon fire, cavalry charges, and infantry melees. Men fought with bayonets, musket butts, and even their bare hands amidst the smoke and screams. At the height of the struggle, a massive French and Saxon cavalry charge, thousands of horsemen thundering across the plain, finally overwhelmed the defenders. By mid-afternoon, the Raevsky Redoubt had fallen to the French. The Russian center was broken. At this critical moment, Napoleon had a decision to make. His marshals begged him to commit his final elite reserve, the Imperial Guard. These were his finest soldiers, veterans of a dozen campaigns, who had not yet been sent into the fight. Unleashing them now could have shattered the exhausted Russian army completely. But Napoleon hesitated. He was over 1,000 miles from Paris, deep in hostile territory, with a long and dangerous retreat ahead of him. The Guard was his final insurance policy. Looking at the sheer carnage and the stubborn resistance of the Russians, he famously said, "I will not have my Guard destroyed. 800 leagues from France, one does not wreck one's last reserve." That decision has been debated by historians ever since. Was it prudence or a failure of nerve? By refusing to commit the Guard, Napoleon allowed Kutuzov's army to survive. The Russians, though battered and bleeding, were not annihilated. They were able to conduct an orderly retreat under the cover of darkness, leaving the French in possession of a battlefield that was little more than a giant open grave. When the guns finally fell silent, the scale of the devastation was almost unimaginable. It's estimated that between 70,000 and 100,000 men became casualties in just 12 hours of fighting. The fields were a carpet of bodies. Every ravine was filled with the dead and dying. The French had captured the battlefield, so technically, they were the victors. A week later, Napoleon entered a deserted and burning Moscow, expecting a surrender from the Tsar that would never come. But Borodino was a Pyrrhic victory in the truest sense. He had won the ground, but at a cost that his army could not sustain. He had failed to destroy the Russian will to fight. Kutuzov, despite losing the field and giving up Moscow, had achieved his strategic goal. He had saved his army and inflicted irreplaceable losses on the invaders. As he reported to the Tsar, "The French army, under the command of Napoleon himself, has been shattered against the Russian army." In a way, he was right. The Grande Armée that fought at Borodino was effectively destroyed. The losses in men and, crucially, horses were so severe that they crippled Napoleon's ability to fight and maneuver for the rest of the campaign. The horrific retreat from Moscow that followed, through the brutal Russian winter, sealed their fate. Borodino wasn't the final act, but it was the turning point, the bloody climax from which Napoleon's 1812 campaign, and ultimately his empire, would never recover. Leo Tolstoy, in his masterpiece War and Peace, called it a victory of spirit, a moral victory for the Russian people who stood firm in the face of the greatest military genius of the age. It remains a powerful symbol of Russian resilience and a grim testament to the devastating human cost of ambition. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey back to 1812. If you found this dive into history fascinating, please give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing to our channel for more stories from the past. Let us know in the comments what historical event you'd like to see us cover next. Until then, stay curious.